Could President Trump put an end to birthright citizenship? He says he can do it by executive order. We'll talk about that with the founder of Freedom Watch, Larry Klayman. And the migrant caravan inches north, migrant caravans, toward the U.S. border as the Pentagon sends more than 5,000 troops to block them. And is the housing market slowing down, or are the reports getting it wrong? Mortgage broker Debbie Bloyd is here to tell us all of that and more coming up during this hour of America Talks Live.
It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Guess
14th
what?
Amendment.
You don't.
You don't.
Number one, you don't need that. Number two,
I mean, that's in dispute.
You could definitely
That's very much in dispute.
Well, you can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it just with an executive order. Now, how ridiculous. We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
That, of course, is President Trump in an exclusive interview with Axios on HBO, saying that he plans to end birthright citizenship by executive order. And that's the first time we've heard of this. Very interesting.
Well, you know, it's interesting, right? Because it is interesting, because we covered a little bit in the last segment something that Senator Jacob Howard said in 1866, one of those who drafted the 14th Amendment, and it appears that at the very least, this will go to the Supreme Court to be clarified.
Lots of questions. So for more on this, let's welcome in our next guest, former federal prosecutor and founder of Freedom Watch, Larry Klayman. Larry, as always, thank you so much for your time. Larry, on this, we're hearing all sorts of things about this. I'd love to get your take. One of our guests today, the Attorney General from the state of Texas, said he thought it would take about a year, but that it probably would go to the Supreme Court if this all goes down as we expect it to, now that the president has made his declaration as he has. We're also hearing that perhaps the intent of the writers, John did some research in the Library of Congress this morning and found that the intent of the primary writer of the 14th Amendment said straight up he did not intend for this to apply to foreigners, or even actually he named children of ambassadors. There's case law, I'm sure you know this, as a guest of ours a little earlier in the show also alluded. There's case law that says that, in fact, it didn't apply to American Indians and some other groups that you might think it would apply to. So what's your take and what's your prediction on how this is going to play out?
Well, I agree with President Trump. His motivation is pure, it's good, it makes sense. It's time that we end this practice. The issue is what is actually said in the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, it talks about naturalizing children that are born here. They're, in fact, citizens if they're within the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, technically speaking, anybody that's here is within our jurisdiction. If you commit a crime or you do something else, you can be held accountable for that. So, yes, it is a question that will go to the Supreme Court. I think what the president's trying to do is to start a discussion about this, because if he doesn't succeed at the Supreme Court, he obviously wants to try to do it in legislation. Of course, if the Democrats take the House, that's not likely, and also the Senate, because you need 2/3 here. But you also have to go for a constitutional amendment. So I think it's good that he's getting the discussion going, and there's a good chance that he will prevail at the Supreme Court, but it's not clear the issue of what does jurisdiction mean in the 14th Amendment. And all this other stuff is not defined. And of course, constitutionalists don't look generally outside of the Constitution for definitions.
But Larry, let me ask you, would that be enough? Would a Supreme Court decision or even a legislative solution, hypothetically speaking, the Dems don't take the House, we've got 2/3 votes in the Senate, would that be enough, or would it still require a convention of states for a new constitutional amendment to override that first provision in the 14th?
It generally would. You know, the framers made it difficult for a reason. You can't change the Constitution that quickly.
Right.
But I think the president has an arguable legal point. I think he should use it. It will get the discussion going, and we'll see where it comes out. It's right now, it's a Hail Mary. We don't know how that would come out.
All right, Larry, let's take a hard turn now and move over to talking about this Pittsburgh synagogue massacre. I don't even like to call it a shooting. The suspect, Robert Bowers, was in court yesterday, and he stands accused of killing 11 and wounding 6 others, 4 of those police officers. This is now the worst attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. So now, just putting on your hat as a former federal prosecutor, somebody that might have been one of those assistant U.S. attorneys assigned to a case like this, somebody handing down these charges, what can we expect to see Bowers charged with? And what type of, I know they're seeking the death penalty. Tell us a little bit about that process. There's apparently a provision where those from the local U.S. Attorney's Office need to ask Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, for permission to seek the death penalty. Just explain how this works, please.
First of all, this individual, Bowers, can be charged under Pennsylvania law for murder, plain and simple. I mean, that covers it. In terms of the federal law, there's hate crimes laws that are involved there. And yes, of course, the Attorney General will be in charge of making the decision on whether to prosecute Bowers, given the fact that the state will obviously do it as well. So it's a multi-jurisdictional, to use the term again, process between Pennsylvania and the federal government. But Sessions obviously, hopefully, will be involved. He hasn't been involved in anything else, John, of importance. So maybe this is an opportunity for him to do something for a change.
All right, Larry, let's talk about those suspicious packages and the guy they have in custody for those, Cesar Sayoc Jr. Now, his appears to be solely, a federal prosecution. What types of charges is he facing, and what type of jail time might he wind up doing? Prison time.
This is interesting. He's being charged primarily with mailing a firearm illegally, not a firearm, but an explosive illegally through the mail. And I wonder, we don't trust the FBI anymore, and particularly Christopher Wray, who's an establishment character, the director. But were these really bombs? Were they intended to go off, or were they intended to scare? So it would seem that rather than being charged with attempted murder, they're charging him with simply mailing explosives in the mail. That's the primary count from what I've heard. So we need to look into this. I mean, I think this guy, there's some truth to this, I believe. Others have raised this possibility. I think he may have been put up to do this. I think he may have been paid off by the Democrats or people like that. The guy's not too smart. He's a former stripper. He's a former bodybuilder and wrestler. I mean, some people are smart, that do that, but he doesn't seem too bright. And he could have been manipulated. And I think there needs to be more disclosure to the American people as to who this guy is. But in terms of your question, he can be thrown the book at for everything. But apparently they're not doing it. And that's interesting.
Well, is that indicative to you that maybe these devices were inoperable? I mean, obviously no one was hurt. These were intercepted by layers of security, the respective agencies or private entities responsible for security before they ever reached their intended targets. So are the, let's call them lackluster charges, indicative to you that maybe these were inoperable devices that were incapable of actually exploding and hurting anyone?
Yeah, I think that seems to be the supposition here, the inference, the presumption, as lawyers would put it. It's very, very strange. And some people have theorized this guy was a patsy, that he was put up to this. It certainly came at a very opportune time going into the midterm elections. None of these bombs exploded, thank God. But, my own gut feeling is that these weren't even bombs. They were just intended to scare. But yet the FBI, who worked against President Trump, both before and after the election, may be inclined to play the game again and not come clean with exactly what they know. And Sessions as well, who's become the darling of the leftist media, he's going to need a new job probably in 2 weeks. And I don't think the American people are getting the full truth here.
Well, let me ask you about that, Larry, because I'm a guy who really despises conspiracy theories. But I agree with you. I have a hard time on this one. Here's a guy who's allegedly broke. He claims to be partially disabled to an extent, living with his parents, kicked out of their home, reports that he's then living in his van. Any way you slice it, this cost a little bit of money to do. This took some know-how to do. It just seems, and I don't know how you feel about it, Gina, implausible to me that he's the only suspect in the case.
Well, I think to me, John, and I want your comment on this, Larry, for me, the part that is the most suspicious is, again, how little we know. It's reminiscent to me, not the tragedy, because of course no one was killed here, thank God, but of the Vegas massacre, where we just have so few facts that have ever come to light and been shared with the American people. I feel like we should know more by this point. I understand keeping some information, you know, under wraps until you have the proper arrests and stuff, but if they're sure they have the right arrest, why don't we know if all of these units, for example, the devices were explosive or not? Why don't we know more about the charges they're planning to pursue and what his background is and who he communicated with prior to these incidents, Larry?
You're absolutely right. And it's not just Vegas. We know nothing about Vegas. I think Paddock, frankly, was a government informant or agent. He went off the reservation. The government didn't obviously want to kill all those people, but it's covering up the fact that he was working for them. That's my guess. And I've had cases where that has been the case in the past. Look at what happened with Richard Jewell in the Olympic bombing, where the FBI pinned a crime on him and he didn't do it. Right. Look at what happened with anthrax, where they pinned a crime on two people. One of them committed suicide, who weren't involved with the anthrax after 9/11. You can't trust the FBI. You can no longer trust the Department of Justice. It's being run by Rod Rosenstein, who wanted to get wired, apparently, and set the president up for being removed under the 25th Amendment. So the American people need to demand answers here, and they don't have them. And they don't have them in a number of fronts. And that's why we've lost confidence in our justice system. It's why we have a Freedom Watch, if I may say. You can go to freedomwatchusa.org and sign up for our Justice League, because we're trying to bring real cases here. But our government Justice Department has become the Department of cover-up and injustice.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens post-midterm elections for
Sure will.
sure. Larry, we always appreciate your insight. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to see you, Larry.
You too.
All right, coming up, how could the stock market volatility we're seeing affect the midterms? Stephen Moore is here to discuss right after the break. You're not going to want to miss it. Stick with us.